Let your eyelids grow heavy now, and let your thoughts drift back, not just years, but millennia, to a time when empires rose like shadows upon the Fertile Crescent, and mighty cities thrummed with life beneath the desert stars. Tonight, I invite you to step into the warm, whispering sands of ancient Mesopotamia. As the day fades and sleep beckons you gently closer, I will tell you the story of the Assyrian Empire, a kingdom of fierce warriors and wise kings, towering ziggurats and hidden scrolls, of gods carved in stone and cities swallowed by time. But this is not just a tale of war and glory. It is a journey across centuries of human memory, through whispers of clay tablets buried in ruins and the breathless silence of forgotten temples. We will walk through Nineveh under moonlight, where the libraries of kings once glowed with torchlight. We will ride with messengers along dusty roads lined with cypress trees, and stand on the ramparts of cities as invaders approach like storm clouds. The Assyrians were not always mighty. They began in the shadows, beside the slow-moving Tigris, patient and watching. But when they rose, oh, how they rose! Their power thundered like distant drums across the Near East, through Babylon and Egypt, from the Zagros Mountains to the shores of the Mediterranean. And yet they vanished. Their cities broken, their gods silent, their stories scattered like sand in the wind. So tonight, as the world outside your window slows and softens, let us remember them in the comfort of your bed. Allow the echoes of this ancient world to lull you into stillness. Let the names of kings and cities roll gently through your mind like waves on a long-forgotten shore. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the flickering torchlight of memory illuminate your dreams. And before we begin, I'd love to know, from where in the world are you listening to this story? What time is it for you? Is the sun rising behind your curtains? Or are the stars keeping you company like sentinels from above? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. I love knowing where these journeys find you. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. Imagine the sound of water, gentle and constant, lapping against the banks of a river that has flowed for thousands of years. The sky above is pale and endless, and a breeze stirs the reeds along the edges of a land just waking from its long slumber. Before there was an empire, before swords and kings and conquests, there was a river, the Tigris, swift, changeable, and eternal. It carved its path through the sun-baked earth of northern Mesopotamia, winding its way past fields of barley and wild date palms, through narrow valleys and fertile plains. The people who settled beside it did not yet call themselves Assyrians. Not yet. They were farmers, shepherds, artisans. They spoke soft words in Akkadian and built their homes from clay shaped by hand. And yet, even in these early, quiet days, there was something watchful in them, something that would not sleep forever. On a high bluff overlooking the river, a city began to take shape. Small at first, little more than a cluster of huts, and a shrine to a local god. But over time, those huts became houses. That shrine became a temple. And that god, his name would be spoken by kings, etched in stone, and whispered in battle cries for centuries to come. Ashur. It is from him that the city took its name, and from that city, a people would take theirs. Assyria, child of Ashur. We do not know the name of the first man who raised a wall there, or the woman who lit the first fire in the dark. History often forgets such names. But what we do know is that around the 25th century BCE, a settlement formed on the western bank of the Tigris. It was ideally placed at a crossroads between trade routes that led to Anatolia, Elam, the Zagros Mountains, and the southward path to Sumer and Akkad. This city was not large, not yet mighty, but it had two things others lacked: devotion and patience. Ashur, the god, was not like the many deities of southern Mesopotamia. He was not the god of the wind, or the harvest, or the sun. He was the god of the city itself, a personification of place, spirit, and identity. As the city grew, so too did its god, and as his worship deepened, so did the belief that this place, this people, were destined for more. By the 21st century BCE, Ashur had become a thriving center of trade. Caravans brought tin from the mountains, textiles from the plains, and silver from faraway lands. Merchants gathered beneath the shadow of the temple. Deals were struck over clay tablets, and scribes etched contracts with styluses of bone and reed. And always, always, there was the sound of the river. To understand Assyria, you must understand how this river ran through their souls. The Tigris gave life, but it could also take it away. It flooded without warning, sweeping away crops and homes. It was a teacher, a punisher, and a silent witness to the rise of kings. The early rulers of Ashur were not emperors in the sense we know today. They called themselves NC governors rather than kings. They paid tribute to larger empires, particularly Ur-II, which held sway over much of Mesopotamia during this time. But they watched and waited. In these centuries, the lines between religion, politics, and survival were blurred. The temple of Ashur was not just a place of worship, it was the heartbeat of the city. Priests advised rulers. Rituals marked the seasons. The will of the god was sought before every major decision. Can you see it? The flickering torches in the temple. The stone floors warm beneath the sandals of the priests. The offerings of grain and oil. It was a world where the divine and the daily were inseparable. And then, one day, change began to stir. The empire of Ur weakened. Its kings grew old. Their grip on the north loosened. And Ashur, quiet, steady, devout, took its first steps into independence. A new title appeared, Sharam, king. The rulers of Ashur no longer bowed. They looked outward, beyond their riverbanks, toward the lands that stretched like a canvas waiting to be painted. Trade expanded. Temples grew. Walls were raised higher. It is here, in the twilight between subjugation and sovereignty, that the soul of the Assyrian Empire was born, not in conquest, not in fire, but in faith, in endurance, in a God who bore the same name as his people and their home. And yet, the world beyond Ashur was changing rapidly. To the south, Babylon was stirring under the rise of a king who would become legend, Hammurabi. To the east, Elam plotted and grew stronger. To the west, the lands of the Hittites rumbled with growing power, and in the heart of it all a small city on the Tigris, with walls of mud brick and a temple of stone, waited for its moment. It would come, but before Assyria could rise, it would have to learn to survive. In the next chapter of our journey, we will walk alongside those early kings, men whose names are half lost to time. We'll trace how they balanced trade and faith, diplomacy and ambition, and how the soul of empire slowly began to stir. But for now, let your mind rest beside the flowing river. Let the whisper of reeds and the voice of Ashur lull you toward sleep. They were not yet conquerors, but the river had taught them patience. The city of Ashur had found its rhythm. The river whispered, the temple flickered, and the markets hummed with the sound of foreign tongues. But behind the quiet industry and sacred ritual, something else began to stir, something deeper than trade or prayer. The men who ruled Ashur were no longer merely caretakers of a shrine or overseers of merchants. They had begun to think of themselves as kings, not because of how much land they controlled, nor how many men stood under their banner, but because they had begun to see themselves as chosen by Ashur. From the clay tablets unearthed beneath the ruins of that ancient city, we catch glimpses of their early rule. Their names are rough and ancient: Ushpia, Kikia, Achaia, etched in the flowing, angular script of cuneiform. These were not the names of emperors yet. They were bridge builders, wall raisers, city shapers. Men who looked at the horizon and saw not threat, but possibility. But let us not romanticize too easily. Life in early Assyria was not peace, but persistence. The walls of Ashur were more than symbolic, they were necessary. Enemies lurked to the south, in the remnants of Akkad and the rising tide of Babylon. Raiders moved along the Zagros foothills to the east, and to the north, the wild lands held tribes who bowed to no one. So the kings of Ashur learned to rule in fire. Clay, in this world, was everything. With it, they wrote laws. With it, they built their cities. And when hardened in fire, it became stone hard, much like their resolve. The Assyrians became masters of this medium. They created archives of tablets, records of trade, diplomacy, tribute, a bureaucracy in miniature, long before empire ever reached their gates. And what they could not write, they carved. Simple steels of basalt or limestone, marked with the deeds of kings and the favor of gods, they stood like silent sentinels at the gates of temples, reminding the people who protected them and who ruled them. There is a quiet pride in those early kings, a sense of order amidst chaos. They ruled modest lands, yes, but they ruled them with care and purpose. Ashur grew sturdy under their hands. They fortified it not just with walls, but with identity. It is here that we first see the Assyrian character begin to take form, a mix of devotion, discipline, and a deep respect for lineage. These kings wrote of their fathers and grandfathers. They carved family trees into stone, linking their right to rule not just to the gods, but to the memory of the past. They knew history mattered, and yet power does not grow quietly forever. By the 20th century BCE, the Assyrians were reaching outward once more, this time not with armies, but with merchants. A network of trading colonies sprang up across Anatolia. The most famous of these was Kanesh, a city far to the northwest, in modern-day Turkey, where Assyrian traders set up long-term commercial stations. It is in these distant outposts that the Assyrians sharpened one of their most important tools, not the sword, but the stylus. In Kanesh, archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets, part of a thriving system of communication between Assyrian merchants and their families back home. These letters, some urgent, others petty, many affectionate, offer us a remarkable window into a world so distant, yet so human. Why have you not sent the silver? I am sending you wool. Prepare the account. Do not forget to bring my son back with the next caravan. These were not declarations of conquest, but of life, commerce, love, frustration, longing. The Assyrians, long before they became warriors of the sword, were merchants of the word. Still, behind every tablet, behind every caravan, loomed the desire for more. The kings of Ashur began to envision themselves not just as merchants and governors, but as monarchs in the ancient sense, guardians of a sacred land. And with that sacred duty came a new hunger, security. In response, they organized their first standing garrisons. Not vast armies yet, but trained men loyal not to a tribe, but to a throne. And slowly, military leadership began to rise in prestige alongside religious authority. The balance was beginning to shift. Temples still dominated city life. Festivals still marked the movement of the stars. But the kings were no longer content to worship Ashur. They began to speak for him. Prophecy, rule, destiny. It is around this time, too, that Assyria began adopting the language of divine kingship. Influenced, perhaps, by the great rulers of Akkad or by their Sumerian neighbors, the kings of Ashur began to describe themselves as chosen, appointed by the god Ashur to rule not just over a city, but over many. And with that belief came conflict. Skirmishes broke out along the southern borders. Minor wars, forgotten now, were fought over land, tribute, access to rivers. The kings of Babylon began to take notice. The Elamites grew uneasy, and to the west, the Hittites sent envoys to learn more of these people by the river, who were beginning to think of themselves as an empire. But Assyria was not ready. Not yet. In time, they would build an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the shores of the Mediterranean. But in these early centuries, they were still forming, like iron in a low fire, not yet hammered into a blade. And as one century slipped into another, a shadow approached that would test their resolve. The rise of Babylon under Hammurabi, whose law would shape the ancient world and whose power would humble all rivals. Assyria would be tested, but those early kings, Ushbia, Kikia, Ashur, they had laid the foundation. They had turned clay into stone, trade into power, faith into identity. And though their names may be whispered only by scholars and priests, they were the root from which all Assyrian greatness would grow. In the next chapter, we will enter an age of expansion and collapse. An early empire will rise, glowing briefly like a torch in the dark, before the winds of war blow it out. But tonight, let us remember these kings of clay and fire, quiet kings, careful kings, builders of more than walls. For every great empire begins not in thunder, but in silence. Imagine now the sound of hammers, striking stone, forging bronze, raising walls. Ashur is no longer a simple city on a riverbank. It is becoming a capital, a center, a name spoken with caution in the courts of neighboring kings. It is the dawn of the Middle Bronze Age, around the 19th century BCE, and for the first time, we see Assyria attempt something greater than survival. They begin to expand. This first wave of growth is not one of fire and conquest, but of diplomacy, of trade, of treaties and alliances sealed with gifts and gods. Assyria, under kings like Ereshkigal, begins to reach out to neighboring lands, not as a vassal, but as a partner. Ereshkigal ruled for over 40 years, and his reign is marked by ambition wrapped in pragmatism. He declared himself king of the universe, a bold title borrowed from older empires, but his actions remained cautious. He strengthened trade routes. He built temples. He formalized laws and taxation. His was a reign of foundation, but foundations, no matter how carefully laid, do not guarantee endurance. Assyria's power at this point was still regional, centered around Ashur, with influence stretching toward Anatolia and into the Zagros hills. It was not yet an empire in the traditional sense, but it was more than a city-state. It existed in that delicate, dangerous middle place, strong enough to provoke attention, too small to fully defend itself. And attention was coming. To the south, Babylon, once a minor power, had begun its meteoric rise under a brilliant and forceful king, Hammurabi. We know Hammurabi today for his law code, one of the oldest surviving sets of written laws in human history. But in his time, he was more than a legislator. He was a conqueror, a tactician, and most importantly, he was a unifier. Babylon had always looked north with interest, and now, with Assyria growing bold, it became a target. During this period, Assyria's rulers attempted to maneuver carefully. They sent envoys, made treaties, paid homage when necessary. But their independence was fragile, and eventually the winds of war arrived. Around the 18th century BCE, Assyria was conquered and subsumed into Babylon's sphere. Hammurabi marched north, and though Ashur may not have burned, its kings were brought to heel. The temple stood, but the throne lost its teeth. This period, what historians call the Old Assyrian Empire, is both remarkable and tragic. It is a time when Assyria stretched toward greatness, only to be humbled. But from that humbling came strength. Even as they fell under foreign rule, the Assyrians preserved their identity. Unlike other cultures that vanished into their conquerors, the people of Ashur kept their language, their god, their scribes and priests. Babylon could impose governors, but it could not erase memory. And memory in Assyria was everything. Through the long years of Babylonian dominance, the Assyrians waited. It was not the first time they had done so, and it would not be the last. And then, as Babylon's star dimmed, new invaders came not from the south, but the east. The Hurrians, fierce mountain tribes from the Zagros, surged into northern Mesopotamia, throwing the region into chaos. For a time, even the very name Assyria begins to fade from the written record. This era, from roughly 1700 to 1400 BCE, is often called the Assyrian Dark Age, a period where kingship falters, records grow scarce, and the light of civilization flickers low. But darkness is not death. It is in this time that the spirit of Assyria is tested and refined. Small kings continue to rule from Ashur, even if their power is limited to the city itself. Local dynasties rise and fall. Foreign rulers pass through like storms, but the heart of Ashur beats on. They continue to write. They continue to build. They continue to remember. And then, just as suddenly as it had fallen silent, Assyria begins to speak again. In the 14th century BCE, a new dynasty rises from the ashes. Kings like Ashur-uballit, I step into the vacuum left by the declining Hurrians and fading Babylonians. They reassert control over their city, then over their neighbors. And for the first time in over 2 centuries, Assyria is truly independent again. And not only independent, but ambitious. Ashur-uballit does something revolutionary. He begins to write to Egypt, the most powerful kingdom of the ancient world. In surviving letters from the Amarna archives, he addresses the pharaoh as an equal, calling himself King of Assyria, and demanding recognition on the world stage. It is a stunning moment. The embers of a forgotten empire had never gone cold. They had only waited. By the end of this period, Assyria has reestablished itself not just as a city-state, but as a regional kingdom, with growing military might and a renewed sense of purpose. The lesson of the First Empire, its fragile rise and crushing fall, had not been lost. It had been absorbed. From this point forward, Assyria would never again be a mere trader or bystander. They had learned to speak softly, to wait patiently, to endure humbly. But now, they would learn to conquer. In the next chapter, we will enter the silent centuries, a strange, quiet stretch of time where records thin and power wavers. Yet beneath the stillness, something sharp is forming. A new kind of kingdom, one not satisfied with survival, but for now, rest in the memory of these early kings. They dreamed of empire, and though their dreams were broken, the dream itself lived on. History, like the rivers that nourished it, has its floods and droughts, its roaring kingdoms and its quiet ruins. Some ages are filled with noise of chariots, of conquest, of proclamations etched in stone. Others pass almost without a whisper. This is one of those silent stretches. We have now stepped into what scholars call the Assyrian Dark Age, a span of roughly 300 years, from around 1700 BCE to 1400 BCE, where the grand narrative seems to dim. The clay tablets grow fewer, the inscriptions fall silent, and the kings, they come and go like distant stars behind heavy cloud. But do not mistake silence for absence. The city of Ashur still stands, pressed close to the banks of the Tigris. The temple of the god Ashur still sends incense into the desert sky. The scribes still scratch records into clay, though their hands are tired and their words less certain. What happened during this time? It is difficult to say with absolute clarity. Much of what we know comes from fragments, king lists, broken stele, scattered diplomatic letters. But even from the scattered pieces, a picture begins to form. A picture not of collapse, but of resilience. Let us begin with what we do know. After the fall of the old Assyrian Empire and the rise of Hammurabi's Babylon, the northern lands fell under increasing pressure from the Hurrians, a mountain people from the northeast, who established the kingdom of Mitanni. Mitanni would become a powerful force in the region, stretching its influence from the upper Tigris all the way into Syria. They were expert charioteers, skilled diplomats, and capable of binding neighboring states into loose alliances. For a time, Assyria became a vassal, a tributary bound to the will of a foreign court. This was no small humiliation for a people who remembered when they had once ruled their own trade colonies and sent letters to kings far away. But Assyria endured. Their kings, though forced to acknowledge Mitanni overlords, never abandoned their city or their identity. They maintained their rituals, kept the old records, traced their lineages like precious heirlooms. They waited. Waiting, after all, was something the Assyrians had mastered. And while they waited, something else was happening quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface. The military spirit of Assyria, long dormant, began to reawaken. They observed the tactics of Mitanni, their use of horses and chariots, their centralized command structure. Assyrian society, already disciplined by religion and administration, began to slowly reorganize itself, not just for defense, but for eventual retaliation. And it wasn't just military change. The administrative heart of Assyria grew stronger in silence. Officials became more professional. Provincial oversight became more efficient. The kings, even with foreign influence over them, retained surprising control over internal affairs. In short, they were learning. Assyria in this period reminds one of a river in drought, narrowed, slow, forgotten by the world around it, but still moving, still alive. Every so often, a name emerges from the mist. Kings like Ashur and Enlil-Nasir, rulers who held the line, who kept the city breathing, who passed the flame from one hand to the next. They ruled in obscurity, but without them, the empire to come would never have been possible. Meanwhile, far to the south, Babylon fell into disarray. Hammurabi's great house weakened. His descendants could not hold the same grip over the land. The Kassites, a new foreign power, swept into Babylon and claimed it as their own. The entire Near East was in flux. Nothing was certain. Everything was in motion, and it is in such motion that Assyria found its opportunity. By the mid-15th century BCE, the power of Mitanni began to weaken. Pressured from the east by the Hittites, and from the south by a resurgent Egypt, the kingdom of Mitanni fractured into rival factions and client kings. Their grip over Assyria, already delicate, slipped. And in that moment, a new kind of Assyrian king stepped forward. His name was Ashur, and though we'll explore his reign more deeply in the next chapter, it is important to understand this. He would not have risen had it not been for the dark ages that came before him. He was the product of quiet resilience, of lessons learned in humility, of strength forged not in glory, but in obscurity. The Assyrians who followed him were not the merchants of Canish, nor the city-bound rulers of Ashur's early days. They were iron-willed, sharpened by centuries of subjugation, ready to strike when the moment was right. And strike they would, but before that, let us reflect. We often think of history in terms of moments, great battles, grand decrees, conquests etched into stone. But what about the years between? The silent centuries, the people who held the walls while no songs were sung of them. Assyria's greatest strength was not its armies, it was its memory. While empires around them rose and vanished, they remained. They bent, but did not break. They were quiet, but never still. And when the winds of change began to blow again, they were ready. In our next chapter, we will meet the king who would take that long-preserved ember and strike it into flame. A new Assyria will rise, bolder, sharper, hungrier. But tonight, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift back to those long, forgotten years when kings walked beneath shadowed skies, and the only music was the wind through broken reeds. History does not sleep, it simply waits. The age of waiting is over. The rivers still flowed, and the temples still stood. But now, the air over Assyria crackled with something new, certainty. The kings who once ruled humbly beneath the gaze of foreign overlords were gone. In their place stood warriors cloaked in gold and blood, bearing not only the crown but the sword. Of these kings, none cast a longer, more terrifying shadow than Ashur-nasir-pal-II. He came to the throne around 883 BCE, in an age where Assyria had reasserted its independence and was ready, desperately ready, to seize more than survival. His ancestors had begun the expansion. Ashur-nasir-pal would accelerate it violently. But first, let us meet the man himself. Ashur-nasir-pal was not a builder by nature, though he would build. He was not a writer by inclination, though scribes would carve his words into walls. He was, above all, a conqueror, a man whose vision of kingship was soaked in iron and absolute will. He inherited a kingdom that was strong, but still regional, boxed in by hostile neighbors and bitter rivals. To the west were the Aramean tribes, unruly and mobile. To the north, the mountain peoples who had always tested Assyria's borders. To the south and east, Babylon and Elam stirred like old wolves. Ashur-nasir-pal faced them all and did not flinch. He marched his armies further than any Assyrian king before him, campaigning as far west as the Mediterranean Sea, a journey that would have taken months, cutting through hostile territory, burning cities that dared resist, and striking deals with those wise enough to surrender. But it was how he conquered that made him infamous. From surviving inscriptions, we know his methods were not merely tactical, they were psychological. He understood that fear was more powerful than the sword itself. One of his own proclamations survives. I stormed the mountain peaks and took them. In the midst of the mighty mountains, I slaughtered them. With their blood, I dyed the mountains red like wool. The heads of their warriors I cut off, and I formed them into a pile. It is not boast for the sake of poetry. It is a message, carved into stone for all to read. Cities heard of him before they saw him. Some fled, some fought. Those who surrendered often lived. Those who resisted were erased. But Ashur-nasir-pal was not mindless in his brutality. He used terror not as chaos, but as policy. Every act of violence was calculated. It was governance by fear, a tool to avoid future uprisings and to assert a divine, unshakable authority. He called himself the vice-regent of Ashur, not merely a king, but the human arm of the god. In this way, every battle he fought, every city he subdued, was not a personal conquest. It was a sacred act. The warriors he led were unlike any army the region had seen. The Assyrian military under Ashur-nasir-pal became professional, organized, and disciplined. It was no longer a militia of farmers and conscripts, but a permanent, salaried force with specialists, siege engineers, chariot divisions, and intelligence agents. They marched under banners bearing the image of Ashur, their god, and Ashur-nasir-pal, his chosen. They were feared not just for their violence, but for their efficiency. Yet, even as he carved a path of fire through the Near East, Ashur-nasir-pal was no mere destroyer. He was also a builder of cities, a patron of art, a master of image. In the heart of Assyria, He transformed an old provincial town into a royal capital that would be etched forever into the story of empire, Calhoun known today as Nimrud. Here, he summoned the greatest craftsmen in the land to erect temples, palaces, and grand reliefs that depicted his campaigns, his gods, his lion hunts. The city was laid out with precision and adorned with towering lamashu, winged bulls, with human faces meant to ward off evil. Inside the Northwest Palace, walls were lined with alabaster slabs etched with scenes of battle and tribute. One hall alone was more than 150 feet long, its every inch carved with the king's victories. It was not a city built for comfort. It was built for message. Calhoun told the world, Assyria was here, and it would not bow again. He also revived annual festivals, aligning himself with ancient tradition while reshaping it to fit his reign. These festivals, often drenched in pageantry and sacrifice, were meant not only to please the gods, but to remind the people who stood at the center of the divine order. And yet, for all his strength, Ashur was not immortal. After more than 2 decades of relentless rule, his health began to fail. He died peacefully, it seems, in his palace at Calhoun. But what he left behind was not peace. He left a kingdom, transformed, militarized, centralized, feared. He left behind a model of kingship that would echo through the reigns of every Assyrian monarch to follow. Most of all, he left a question in the hearts of every neighboring kingdom. If this is what one king could do, what would his son become? In the next chapter, we will meet that son, Shalmaneser III, who would inherit his father's ambition and push the empire to even greater heights. But for now, rest your thoughts in the flickering torchlight of Calhoun. Imagine the sound of sandals on polished stone, the distant rhythm of drums, the scent of oil and cedar, the murals staring silently from the walls, each telling a tale of power and flame. Ashur did not just rule Assyria, he awakened it. The rising sun crests the edge of the eastern hills, casting long golden fingers over a city like no other. From its towers, the walls of Nimrud gleam with the warmth of freshly baked stone. Statues line the gates, silent and watching. Within, the city stirs not in fear this time, but in awe. This is Calhoun, or as we know it today, Nimrud. It had existed long before as a minor town on the Tigris, but under Ashur II, it was reborn. No longer just a city, it became the capital of Assyria, the heart of an empire in the making. The decision to move the capital here, away from Ashur itself, was more than logistical, it was symbolic. Ashur, brutal as he may have been, understood the psychology of rule. By raising a new capital, he declared a new age, a new order, a fresh throne for a revived god-king. And what he built, there was nothing short of breathtaking. Let us walk now through the streets of Nimrud as it once was. We pass through the massive gates, guarded by the colossal lamashu, winged bulls with human faces, carved from limestone, each weighing many tons. They stand as eternal sentinels, their eyes wide, their wings poised to fly, their bodies rooted in the earth. They are not only protectors, they are statements. I am the king, they say. I am eternal. Within the city, we find the Northwest Palace, the crown jewel of Ashurnasirpal's vision. This sprawling complex, set upon a high terrace, was covered in glazed bricks, the floors polished and cool beneath the feet, the ceilings high and shadowed by cedar beams. The scent of imported incense lingered in the halls. But it is the walls that hold the breath of time. Slab after slab of finely carved bas-reliefs depict the king in his many guises: warrior, priest, hunter, divine servant. These were not simply decorations. They were political theology in stone. In one panel, Ashurnasirpal holds a ritual bucket and cone, anointing the tree of life. In another, he rides his chariot, arrows loosed mid-gallop toward a fleeing lion. Every image repeated the message. This was not merely a man. This was a king of kings, sanctioned by Ashur himself and beloved of the heavens. And yet, there was grace amidst the might. The reliefs show not only war and ceremony, but nature, the curling beard of the king rendered with care, the plumage of birds, the delicate flowers in sacred gardens. Assyrian art, often remembered for its martial themes, also carried a quiet elegance. The palace itself was both home and throne. Within it, foreign dignitaries knelt. Tribute was measured in gold, silver, ivory, and lapis lazuli. Prisoners were paraded through its courtyards. Scrolls were stored in orderly rooms. Priests chanted from the high places, while guards stood beneath the arches, with spears gleaming. Beyond the palace, the city sprawled with planning and purpose. Temples rose alongside granaries. Administrative buildings shared courtyards with sculptors' workshops. Canals were dug to draw water from the Tigris. Roads were paved with stone broad enough for armies, but smooth for the carts of merchants. Nimrud was not just a place to rule. It was a place to be seen ruling. And so it was that under Ashurnasirpal and his successors, Nimrud became the soul of the Assyrian Renaissance. But more than its beauty or power, what made Nimrud so unique was how intentionally it was crafted to reflect the king's will. This was no accidental city, growing haphazard with time. This was a curated vision, where architecture, art, and ritual served a single purpose: to remind the world of Assyria's unshakable place in it. Yet, beneath the marble and order, the city pulsed with tension. We must not forget that Assyria's empire was built by the sword. The riches that adorned Nimrud flowed from plunder. The artists, the builders, even some of the priests, were often captives from foreign lands, brought back as spoils of conquest. The empire was efficient in this cruelty. Entire populations were relocated from their homelands, marched across deserts, resettled under the eye of the Assyrian king. This system, known as mass deportation, would become a central strategy of empire. It weakened rebellion. It created skilled labor forces. It reshaped the very demographic map of the ancient Near East. But it also sowed seeds of hatred, seeds that would one day bloom in fire. Still, for now, Nimrud thrived. Under Ashurnasirpal's son, Shalmaneser III, the city became even more vibrant. The administrative core of empire grew stronger. Tribute flowed from Syria, Phoenicia, Urartu. Assyrian scribes recorded each gift, each envoy, each ounce of silver in detail and pride. And then there were the celebrations. No image is more striking than that of the banquet stele, a carved stone commemorating Ashurnasirpal's grand dedication of Nimrud. According to the inscription, he hosted a feast for 69,574 people, a number likely exaggerated, but significant in its symbolic scope. Imagine it, the smoke of roasting meat curling into the desert sky, the music of harps and drums, courtiers in silk, peasants with full bowls, generals boasting at stone tables. It was not just a party, it was a display of divine abundance. The message was clear. This was a king who could feed the world. But even the brightest cities cast shadows. Nimrud's greatness was built upon fragile foundations, centralized power, militaristic expansion, and the constant need for conquest to sustain its machine. Without war, there would be no tribute. Without tribute, no splendor. It was a glittering engine running on blood. As we step away from Nimrud's wide avenues and carved walls, a quiet truth follows us. Empires that shine this brightly often burn just as fiercely. In the next chapter, we will meet a king who understood the machinery of empire like no other, Tiglath-Pileser III, a man who turned Assyria into an unstoppable machine of conquest, intelligence, and reform. But for now, as you lay your head beneath your own ceiling, far from the stone lions and burning torches, imagine the silence of Nimrud at night. The stars above, the Lamashu standing guard, the moonlight glinting off gold and ivory. Here, the light was not just golden, it was forged. By the time Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the throne in 745 BCE, Assyria was tired. The machine that Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser had built still stood, but it groaned beneath the weight of corruption, court intrigue, and unsteady alliances. The conquests of old had stretched the empire wide, but left its core brittle, and into this brittle world stepped a man of terrifying clarity. Tiglath-Pileser III did not rise gently. He likely seized the throne in a coup, displacing an unpopular king, and securing his claim with immediate, unflinching action. In a world where kings were often seen as either divinely chosen or ceremonially bound, Tiglath-Pileser broke the mold. He wasn't here to preserve tradition. He was here to rebuild the empire from the inside out, and he began not with swords, but with scrolls. The reformer of steel and ink Tiglath-Pileser understood something vital. An empire is only as strong as its infrastructure. His first reforms were administrative. He dismantled the old system of semi-autonomous provinces, many of which had grown too independent, often ruled by hereditary nobles who could act with near impunity. In their place, he installed royally appointed governors, directly accountable to the king, and frequently rotated to prevent loyalty from taking root anywhere but in the crown. This alone changed the game. It meant that no province could function like a fiefdom. Every region, from the orchards near Nineveh to the fortress cities in Syria, now beat in time with the capital. He centralized the bureaucracy, a move centuries ahead of its time. Taxation was standardized. Military conscription became streamlined. Reports flowed from all corners of the empire to the palace with terrifying efficiency. The empire began to hum like a machine, disciplined, monitored, and ruthlessly organized. Tiglath-Pileser created what some modern historians have called the world's first total state. But he did not stop at paperwork. A new kind of army, the king understood that the backbone of Assyrian power had always been its military. But under his predecessors, it had grown bloated and inconsistent, so he restructured it from the ground up. Instead of relying solely on conscripts or feudal levies, Tiglath-Pileser created a standing, professional army, permanently maintained and trained, with a clear hierarchy and specialization. This army included infantry divisions equipped with standardized iron weapons, charioteers and cavalry, now used in increasingly sophisticated battlefield maneuvers, engineers trained in siegecraft and able to reduce walled cities with terrifying speed, scouts and spies, the eyes and ears of the king across the empire. And unlike previous armies, this one did not return home after a campaign. It moved like a tide, occupying, pacifying, and reorganizing as it went. Wherever it marched, the empire followed new roads, new governors, new temples, all under the seal of Tiglath-Pileser. This was conquest as policy, not impulse. The expansion engine under Tiglath-Pileser, Assyria's borders expanded dramatically. He marched west into Syria, taking cities like Arpad and reducing formerly independent states to provincial units. Some resisted and were crushed. Others surrendered and were absorbed, their elites replaced, their gods tolerated but subordinated. He moved south into Babylonia, an ancient rival that had long held onto its prestige, even in decline. Rather than destroy it outright, Tiglath-Pileser played a more subtle game, installing loyal governors, marrying political influence with religious respect. By 729 BCE, he crowned himself King of Babylon, uniting the crowns for the first time and folding Babylon's symbolic power into his own. He even reached into Israel and Judah, reshaping the politics of the Levant through force and diplomacy. Tribute poured in from kings who preferred subjugation to obliteration. Where once Assyria had simply conquered, Tiglath-Pileser converted conquest into permanence. But his most enduring, and perhaps most chilling, innovation was the mass deportation system. Though used before, Tiglath-Pileser turned it into a state policy. Entire populations were uprooted from conquered lands and resettled across the empire. Craftsmen from Damascus might find themselves in Nineveh, farmers from Israel transplanted to the Zagros foothills. It served several purposes. It broke the spirit of resistance. It provided skilled labor where needed. It wove a more heterogeneous, interdependent empire, one where no province could rise without the rest. In this way, rebellion was not only punished, it was made impossible. The cold gaze of the king, and yet, despite all this efficiency, all this organization and might, Tiglath-Pileser remains a strangely distant figure in the historical record. His inscriptions are cold, methodical. Where Ashur-Nasirpal boasted of rivers of blood, Tiglath-Pileser wrote of systems, numbers, and logistics. He was less interested in spectacle than in durability. He ruled not like a lion, but like a clockmaker, every gear placed with purpose, every piece made to serve. And it worked. By the time of his death in 727 BCE, Assyria was not only stronger than ever, it was inevitable. No power in the Near East could rival it. The empire was no longer a collection of cities with armies. It was a single entity, a living, breathing mechanism that spanned rivers, mountains, and deserts. Tiglath-Pileser had done what few rulers ever achieve. He created a model so complete that his successors could simply step into it. But of course, power creates echoes, and in the wake of his reign, others would come, each standing on the system he built, each reaching further, demanding more. In our next chapter, we will return to Babylon, that eternal rival, to explore the long and tangled relationship between it and Assyria, a story of envy, worship, betrayal, and blood. But for now, as you close your eyes and feel the weight of centuries on your chest, consider this. Sometimes, the most dangerous rulers are not the loudest, nor the bloodiest, but the ones who turn empires into machines. There are places on this earth so old, so storied, that even the conquerors who burn them down do so with trembling hands. Babylon was such a place. By the time the Assyrians looked southward with conquest in their eyes, Babylon was already a legend. Its ziggurats pierced the clouds. Its scribes chronicled history before Assyria had mastered the art of war. Its gods Marduk, Ishtar, Nabu were known from the Zagros to the Nile. And yet, it was vulnerable. In the 8th century BCE, Babylon had grown fractured, its cities divided among petty rulers, Aramean tribes, and feuding priests. It remained powerful in culture, in memory, and myth, but not in sword and shield. Still, for Assyria, Babylon was never just a place to conquer. It was a mirror, and mirrors can be unsettling things. The reverent conqueror Tiglath-Pileser III, cold administrator that he was, knew Babylon could not be ruled with brutality alone. He did not sack its temples. He did not desecrate Marduk's shrines. Instead, he crowned himself king of Babylon in 729 BCE, kneeling before the statue of the very god that Assyrians once saw as a rival to Ashur. This moment wasn't just ceremonial, it was deeply strategic. By honoring Babylon's religion, Tiglath-Pileser positioned himself not as a foreign invader, but as a restorer of cosmic order. It was a masterstroke of political theater. The Babylonian elite priests, astronomers, merchants were placated, if not entirely convinced. But the people remembered. They remembered the pride of Hammurabi, the glory of the old kings, the time before Assyria's rise, and under the surface of cooperation, resentment brewed. A land that refused to bow Babylon had always been difficult to hold. Its population was vast, diverse, and steeped in ancient customs. Loyalty was not easily given, and revolts were frequent. Even Tiglath-Pileser's careful rule could not extinguish the flame of Babylonian self-identity. After his death, the delicate balance began to unravel. Shalmaneser V, his successor, struggled to maintain authority, and by the time Sargon II took power, through what many believe was another palace, Babylon had broken free again. Rallying around a Chaldean tribal leader named Marduk-Apla-Iddina II, also known as Merodach-Baladan, this man would become a thorn in the side of Assyria for decades. From 721 BCE, he ruled Babylon with charisma and cunning, uniting diverse peoples, Chaldeans, Arameans, and Old Babylonians, into a front of resistance. He corresponded with foreign kings, sowed rebellion in Assyrian provinces, and claimed divine legitimacy. To Assyria, this was heresy dressed as sovereignty. Sargon II would respond not with negotiation, but with a full-scale invasion. In 710 BCE, he marched south, determined to erase Merodach-Baladan from the map. Cities fell, armies scattered, and eventually Sargon entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a chosen king, claiming, like Tiglath-Pileser, the title of King of Babylon while staging public acts of piety in its temples. But the war had left scars, deep ones. A kingdom of ghosts, you see. To rule Babylon was to hold a viper in your hands. Even when calm, it was dangerous. Sargon tried. He rebuilt temples, funded scholars, ordered new astronomical texts. He even respected the sacred Akitu festival, where the Babylonian king would ritually humble himself before Marduk. And yet, the Babylonians never forgot that their king now answered to Nineveh. They never forgot that even a gentle Assyrian hand was still a foreign hand. When Sargon died mysteriously in 705 BCE, his body never recovered. It was seen not as a tragedy in Babylon, but as divine justice. Merodach-Baladan returned once more from exile and tried to reclaim the throne, his last desperate gasp before Assyrian wrath returned under Sennacherib. This would mark the end of reverence and the beginning of revenge. Sennacherib's wrath, where Tiglath-Pileser had shown caution and Sargon had tried piety, Sennacherib came with fire. Infuriated by repeated rebellions, insulted by Babylon's insolence, he made a decision that shocked even his own empire. In 689 BCE, after years of on and off conflict, he destroyed Babylon. Let that sink in. Not just subdued it, not just took its crown, he leveled it. Temples burned. The great ziggurat, possibly the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, was dismantled brick by brick. Statues were stolen or smashed. The canals clogged with blood and ash. Some records suggest the city's entire population was deported. This was no conquest. It was obliteration. And yet, even this did not break Babylon's spirit. It lingered like incense smoke after a ritual, rising even through ruin. Reflection by lamplight as you lie back now, maybe with only the flicker of a bedside lamp lighting the room. Think of this: 2 cities, 2 dreams. Assyria, pragmatic, brutal, precise. Babylon, ancient, mystical, proud. Together they shared a geography, a mythology, even blood. But never trust between them. Only echoes of grudges and dreams. And Sennacherib, who sought to bury Babylon forever, would find that you cannot kill an idea. His own son, Esarhaddon, would later rebuild the city in an act of penance, or perhaps of fear. The 2 cities would remain entangled, right to the bitter end. In the next chapter, we will climb the heights of Assyria's might, to the dazzling reign of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, when the empire reached its peak and began to crack from within. But for now, breathe deeply and listen to the silence between the stories. For sometimes, in that silence, Babylon still speaks. History does not always shout when it changes. Sometimes it sighs deep, heavy, and full of warning. When Sennacherib fell, assassinated by his own sons, possibly in retribution for the destruction of Babylon, the throne passed not to his murderers, but to a younger son, Esarhaddon, quiet, bookish, and deeply superstitious. Esarhaddon might seem, at first glance, an unlikely emperor, but he had learned from his father's errors. Where Sennacherib scorched earth, Esarhaddon sought to heal it, and his reign would bring both golden light and the shadow of what was coming. The healer of 2 worlds, Esarhaddon ascended the throne in 681 BCE during a time of confusion and mourning. Assyria had been shaken not militarily, but spiritually. The murder of a king was not just scandalous, it was a cosmic fracture. The world, they believed, had tilted. But Esarhaddon moved quickly to restore balance. One of his first acts was to rebuild Babylon. Brick by brick, shrine by shrine, he undid what his father had done. He even claimed that the gods themselves had ordered him to restore the sacred city. This wasn't just a political move. It was a cleansing, a spiritual restoration meant to heal both his empire and his conscience. And it worked, at least for a while. The empire expands again. Esarhaddon was not just a restorer, he was a conqueror too, though a subtler one than his predecessors. Under his rule, Assyria reached its furthest territorial extent. To the east, he kept the Medes at bay through alliances and marriages. To the north, he pacified rebellious hill tribes. And to the west, he continued to pressure the kingdoms of Syria and the Levant, keeping them bound with tribute and fear. But it was in the south, far beyond Assyria's usual reach, that he would make history. In 675 BCE, Esarhaddon launched an invasion of Egypt. This was unprecedented. Egypt was ancient, proud, and long thought beyond Assyria's grasp. Yet his armies swept through the Nile Valley, defeating Pharaoh Taharka, and in 671 BCE, Esarhaddon entered Memphis, becoming the first Assyrian king to rule over Egypt. For a moment, the empire seemed eternal. From the mountains of Iran to the pyramids of Giza, Assyria stood as master of the known world. But time, like the Tigris, does not stop flowing. Esarhaddon, weary from years of campaigning, fell ill, and in 669 BCE, he died on the road to Egypt, never again to see the capital he had restored. But his legacy would continue in the hands of a son who would become both scholar and scourge. The scholar king Ashur-bani-pal, son of Esarhaddon, took the throne with the ink of tablets still fresh on his fingers. He had been trained not just in warfare, but in scholarship, fluent in Sumerian and Akkadian, well-versed in mathematics, medicine, and ritual. Ashur-bani-pal is the only Assyrian king we know to have read and written extensively, and yet, behind that scholarly gaze burned the ruthless ambition of a true Assyrian monarch. Ashur-bani-pal inherited not just an empire, but its expectations, and he met them with force. He suppressed revolts in Egypt, chased out the rebellious pharaohs, and replaced them with vassals. In Elam, to the east, he unleashed one of the most brutal campaigns in ancient history. Cities were razed, kings were dragged in chains to Nineveh, and the Elamite civilization was left in ruins, its culture erased like chalk from stone. He dealt swiftly with internal threats, too, even executing his own brother Shamash-Shamukin, who ruled Babylon, but dared to challenge him in a devastating civil war. Ashur-bani-pal responded not with forgiveness, but with fire. Babylon was spared destruction this time, but the message was clear. Mercy was no longer the policy of Assyria, the library of dreams, and yet, amid the carnage, Ashur-bani-pal built something wondrous. In his palace at Nineveh, he collected clay tablets from across Mesopotamia, epics, spells, treatises on medicine and astronomy, royal decrees, dictionaries. He sent scribes to copy ancient texts from Babylonian temples. He even ordered translations. This treasure trove would become the library of Ashur-bani-pal, the first systematically curated library in recorded history. Within its walls, legends were preserved, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known literary work in the world. Perhaps Ashurbanipal, despite all his campaigns, understood that empires fall, but words can endure. And yet, as he grew older, the fire of the empire began to flicker. Cracks in the stone Ashurbanipal died sometime after 631 BCE, and with him, something vital left the empire. His successors, less capable, less commanding, squabbled over the throne. Generals seized provinces. Vassal states rebelled. The Chaldeans in Babylon rose again. The Medes to the east began sharpening their blades, and from the west, the Babylonians, newly united and hungry, began to watch Assyria with the gaze of a lion circling a wounded beast. Assyria still held its lands, but it no longer held its certainty. The machinery that Tiglath-Pileser had built still turned, but it now groaned under its own weight. The bureaucracy became bloated. The armies, once tireless, now hesitated. The kings, once gods, now feared their own shadows, the view from the peak. And so here we are at the summit of Assyria's story. From the heights of Nineveh, the empire stretched in every direction. Roads ran like veins through conquered lands. Gold flowed through its gates. The gods of dozens of cities now bowed to Ashur. But all summits come with a price. From the top, there is only one way left to go. Down, and in the valley below, a storm was gathering. In our next chapter, we shall stand among the final embers of the empire and witness its fall, a collapse so complete, so sudden, that for centuries it was believed to be a myth. But for now, rest and know that history, like fire, can dazzle even as it begins to fade. It was said that no mortal army could breach the gates of Nineveh. And yet, one day, it rained too hard. For nearly 3 centuries, Nineveh had been the beating heart of Assyria, a city of glittering palaces, wide boulevards, and colossal stone lions. Its walls, stretching nearly 7.5 miles, enclosed temples, gardens, libraries, and the proud center of the ancient world's most feared empire. But in the final decades of the 7th century BCE, Nineveh became something else. A target, a prize, a myth waiting to be undone, a kingdom without its soul after the death of Ashurbanipal. The empire's lifeblood began to drain. The strong kings were gone. The elite military was stretched thin. Revolts sparked in Babylon, in Syria, even in the Assyrian heartland. Generals declared independence. The once flawless bureaucratic machine began to rot with corruption and confusion. The last true Assyrian king, Ashur-etil-ilani, struggled to maintain control from 631 BCE onward. But his reign was short, his legacy faint. The throne passed rapidly into weaker hands. And in the shadows of the east and south, 2 powers rose, ancient rivals with vengeance on their minds. The Babylonians, under the leadership of Nabopolassar, seeking to reclaim their autonomy and glory. The Medes, fierce mountain warriors under Cyaxares, dreaming of empire. In 614 BCE, they formed an alliance, and their eyes turned north to Nineveh. The siege begins. The first blow came not to Nineveh, but to Ashur, the old capital, sacred and symbolic. In 614 BCE, the Medes stormed the city. Temples were looted, altars desecrated. It sent shockwaves through the empire. Ashur had stood for over 1,000 years. Its fall was unthinkable. Now, Nineveh stood alone. In 612 BCE, the full weight of Babylonian Median vengeance came crashing down. Tens of thousands of warriors marched across the Tigris. Archers, chariots, siege towers, and sappers. An ancient army with a modern understanding of war. Nineveh's defenses were legendary walls thick and high, moats deep, stockpiles vast. But the enemy was relentless. For 3 months, the siege dragged on. Each day, the smoke rose higher. Each night, the walls trembled with battering rams and war cries. Then, the sky turned against Assyria. A mighty rainstorm struck. The Kosser River, usually tame, overflowed. The water breached the walls of Nineveh. Whole sections collapsed under the flood's force. What no army could do, nature had begun. And through the breach, the enemy surged. Nineveh fell not in glory, but in fire and flood. The death of a city, the destruction, was swift and merciless. Palaces were looted. Statues of Ashur were shattered. The famed library of Ashurbanipal, once filled with thousands of clay tablets, was buried under rubble forgotten for millennia. Even the royal family could not escape. The last Assyrian king, Sin-Sharishkun, is believed to have perished in the flames, choosing self-immolation over surrender. The Medes and Babylonians showed no mercy. This was not just conquest, it was retribution for centuries of Assyrian rule, brutality, and humiliation. Nineveh burned for days, and as the smoke curled into the heavens, the ancient world watched the impossible happen. The Assyrian Empire was no more. Echoes in the dust in the following years, Assyria's final remnants fled westward. A prince named Ashur-uballit II tried to rally resistance in the city of Haran, calling himself king of Assyria, begging Egypt for aid, but it was too late. In 609 BCE, Haran too was crushed, and with it, the last flicker of Assyria was snuffed out. Its cities fell silent. Its gods, once mighty, were absorbed into the pantheons of its conquerors. Its name became a warning in later scripture and prophecy, a symbol of hubris and divine wrath. Even the Greeks, centuries later, would speak of Nineveh as if it had vanished into myth. And for a long time, that's exactly what it did. Nineveh's ruins were swallowed by earth and time, its location forgotten. Until the 19th century, when archaeologists, guided by whispers in ancient texts, began to dig, and what they found beneath the sands of modern-day Mosul was astonishing. Massive palaces, broken statues, the shattered remains of lion hunts and royal banquets. And buried deep Within clay rooms, the library of Ashur, the world's oldest recorded literature, preserved in cuneiform, silent for thousands of years. A breath before the end now, as you lie in stillness, eyes heavy. Hear the wind sweep over the ruins of Nineveh. The walls no longer stand, but the story still does. Assyria did not vanish in a single blow, nor was it ever truly forgotten. Its kings carved themselves into the memory of the world. Its cities, once feared, now whisper only to the patient listener. In the next chapter, we'll walk among these forgotten ruins, tracing how the empire was rediscovered by modern hands and what its legacy means today. But for now, let your mind drift with the ashes, over rivers long changed, under stars that once looked down on empire. For this is how all great things pass, not with silence, but with stories. For over 2,000 years, Assyria was lost, its cities buried, its language unknown, its kings nothing more than whispers in sacred texts. But then, in the dust of distant deserts, it began to rise again. Imagine walking across a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq. The wind cuts across the dry grass. A few stones poke from the ground, irregular, forgotten. Beneath your feet lie the remains of a mighty city, Nineveh, though no one can say for sure. This was the world in the early 1800s. The Bible spoke of Assyria, of kings like Sennacherib, Tiglath-Pileser, and Shalmaneser. The Hebrew prophets warned of their cruelty, their downfall. But to scholars of the Enlightenment and early 19th century, Assyria was little more than a fable. Its cities swallowed by time, its records unreadable. All of that was about to change. The first clues in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, explorers and diplomats began trekking across the Ottoman Empire, mapping, recording, and collecting. In the north of Mesopotamia, around the Tigris River, locals pointed to strange mounds, Khayanjik, Nimrud, Khorsabad, all said to hold ruins beneath them. Some even believed they sat atop ancient cities, but it wasn't until 1820, when Claudius Rich, a British agent of the East India Company, visited Mosul and began documenting the remains at Khayanjik, that things took a more serious turn. His sketches and notes stirred the curiosity of the European world. What cities lay beneath these mounds? What civilization had built these massive stone foundations? Enter Layard, the spade meets stone, in 1845. A young British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard arrived in northern Iraq, only in his 20s. Layard was ambitious, curious, and untrained in archaeology, but driven by a deep fascination with ancient history. He began to dig at Nimrud, a site believed to be the biblical Kala. What he found stunned the world. Within months, he uncovered colossal statues, human-headed winged bulls, known as Lamashu. These were guardians of palaces, standing over 10 feet tall, carved with exquisite detail. Beyond them lay walls of reliefs, scenes of battles, lion hunts, and royal processions. each stone etched with thousands of tiny marks. Those marks were not decorations, they were writing, cuneiform, a language forgotten for 2,000 years. Cracking the code, it was a mystery that had haunted scholars for centuries. The wedge-shaped script of the ancient Near East, found on countless tablets, but utterly indecipherable. But as more inscriptions were uncovered from Babylon, Susa, and now Nineveh, linguists began to notice patterns. The breakthrough came with the discovery of trilingual inscriptions, especially those from the Persian king Darius I, who had his decrees written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, the last of which turned out to be the language of Assyria, thanks to the painstaking work of scholars like Henry Rawlinson, who copied and studied inscriptions from the Behistun rock in Iran. Cuneiform was finally decoded, and with it, the voices of the Assyrians spoke again, clear, detailed, and shockingly human. The library awakens back at Kyanjik, modern-day Nineveh. Layard and his successors made the greatest discovery of all, the ruins of a royal library. Buried beneath ash and earth, they uncovered room after room filled with clay tablets, many still intact. There were thousands, legal documents, letters, spells, prayers, omens, dictionaries, and myths. Here, in what had once been the library of Ashurbanipal, they found the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood narrative, hymns to Ishtar, astronomical records, and the very texts that described the rise and fall of the Assyrian kings. The empire had fallen in fire, but its words, baked in clay, endured. Today, those tablets lie in museums from London to Baghdad. They whisper in ancient tongues the fears, triumphs, and sorrows of people long gone, and through them, we know Assyria not just as a place of conquest, but as a world of intellect, complexity, and ambition. The shadow of an empire as the 19th century unfolded. More sites were dug, Dur-Sharukin, Ashur, Kartukulti-Ninurta. Archaeologists uncovered entire palaces, temple complexes, and ziggurats. Assyria had not been a myth. It had been a colossus, one whose memory had simply sunk beneath time. But with each discovery came reflection. How had such a mighty empire vanished so completely? Why had its language, art, and cities disappeared, while others, like Greece or Rome, endured in our collective memory? The answer may lie not just in the violence of its fall, but in its loneliness. Assyria ruled through fear, not friendship. It built power, not partnership. And when the center collapsed, there was no one left to carry its torch. Yet in rediscovering Assyria, we rediscover a piece of ourselves. For in the clay tablets, we see that these people, though ancient, were not so different. They worried, they dreamed, they worshipped, they grieved, they loved, and they left behind a trail of stories for us to find, like starlight long after the star is gone. As your breathing softens, picture the ruins beneath the soil, the buried arches, the silent palaces, the forgotten scribes who once scratched symbols into clay by lamplight. In the next section, we will gaze backward over the full arc of Assyria's rise and fall and consider what its legacy means in the broader tapestry of human civilization. But for now, close your eyes. Let the dust settle in your mind and know that even forgotten empires can live again, if only in dreams. In every empire lies a mirror. In Assyria, we glimpse both the brilliance and the brutality of human ambition, a civilization that built high and fell hard, yet still speaks through the ruins it left behind. The winds of time have long swept over the stones of Assyria, softening the edges of its monuments and quieting the once thundering drums of its armies. And yet, as we lean in and listen, we hear something still breathing, lessons etched into the very clay of its memory. This is not simply the end of a kingdom. It is the reflection of a world that dreamed too grand, too fast, and paid the price. A blueprint of power. Assyria was not the first empire the world had seen, but it was the first to master the art of control. Through a finely tuned bureaucracy, vast networks of roads, regional governors, and a postal system that could move messages faster than any before, Assyria created the blueprint that would later inspire the Persians, the Romans, even modern states. Its capital cities were not just seats of power, they were stage sets of majesty. Towering ziggurats, monumental gateways, and wall reliefs that told the story of kings as divine hunters and fearless warriors. Power was performance, and Assyria understood the role better than most. Even their art bore this duality, majestic and merciless. A king slays a lion in one panel. In the next, he dines peacefully in a garden, the severed head of a rival hanging from a tree behind him. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was message, carefully crafted and widely distributed. Assyria ruled by fear, and fear, as they knew too well, can build an empire, but never sustain it. A lesson in hubris. Assyria's rise was forged through conquest, its loyalty bought through terror, and in this, it sowed the seeds of its downfall. Where Rome often absorbed its enemies, granting them roads, rights, and even citizenship, Assyria left its conquered peoples broken, exiled, and resentful. Revolts were common. The borders were always bleeding. And as the empire grew, it became hollow at the center. The kings, obsessed with expansion, rarely built lasting alliances. Their court grew decadent. Their armies, though large, became stretched thin. They ruled the known world, but had few true friends in it. So when the tides turned, when Babylon rose again, when the Medes found common cause, Assyria stood alone. Its fall was not only tragic, it was inevitable. Because when power is absolute but unloved, collapse is only a matter of time. The whisper of words, and yet, for all its violence and ambition, Assyria was also a land of thought. In the royal libraries of Ashur, we find not just records of conquest, but dreams, poetry, medical texts, rituals, star charts, epics, and myths. They collected the stories of their predecessors, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians. In doing so, they became not just rulers of the land, but curators of time. Think of that. An empire that conquered the world, and also paused to copy the story of a man named Gilgamesh, a tale of mortality and meaning that would outlive even its fiercest kings. Even amid its brutality, Assyria was deeply human. It feared the gods. It sought wisdom in omens. It wondered what dreams meant and what came after death. Those clay tablets were buried for millennia, yet today they sit in libraries, studied by quiet scholars, read aloud in classrooms, reimagined in novels and art. Assyria is gone, but its voice, its mind endures, a mirror to our world. Assyria, like every great empire, offers a double-edged lesson. It shows us the heights human civilization can reach: massive cities, ingenious engineering, vast knowledge networks. And it shows us how easily these things can vanish when built on fear, injustice, and overreach. As we walk the fragile thread of our own times, full of might and uncertainty, Assyria reminds us that even the mightiest powers are temporary, that even kings are mortal, and that what lasts longest are not empires, but ideas. The Assyrians believed they were eternal. Their art carved that belief into stone, and yet they were forgotten for 2,000 years. Today we remember them, not to glorify war, but to listen, to see their stories as reflections of our ambition, our mistakes, our beauty, and our potential. Let the dust settle, and so now, let your eyes begin to close. Let the fires of ancient cities dim into the soft twilight of thought. Hear the wind across Nineveh. Feel the hush of tablets buried beneath centuries. See a scribe, bent by lamplight, writing in a script no longer spoken, for a king who no longer reigns, in a land whose name once meant everything. And know that in this quiet, you are connected to a world long gone, and yet somehow still here, through memory, through story, through sleep. Even after its cities turned to dust and its kings faded into silence, Assyria lived on in parables and prophecies, in dread and divine warning, etched into the moral and spiritual fabric of ancient texts. For many, Assyria isn't first encountered in a museum or an archaeological journal. It arrives through scripture, through the trembling words of prophets, through fearsome names whispered from pulpits and echoed in hymns, through Jonah and Nineveh, through Isaiah and destruction, through a memory more myth than map. In this section, we listen not to history as written in stone, but to the voice of Assyria as preserved in holy texts, cultural memory, and the haunted imagination of civilizations who remembered, even when they no longer understood. Nineveh the Great in the Hebrew Bible, Assyria looms as both hammer and lesson. It is first a tool of divine wrath, a power unleashed upon the wayward kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib appear by name. Their conquests, particularly the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, are not just political disasters. They are seen as judgments from God. Yet in the same breath, Assyria becomes a cautionary tale. Take the prophet Isaiah, who condemns Assyria's arrogance. Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger. But when the Lord has finished all his work, he will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart. Isaiah 10:5-12. The Assyrians were chosen as agents of punishment. But their cruelty, their overreach, sealed their own doom. It's a message threaded throughout Scripture. No power, however vast, escapes justice. Not even Assyria. Jonah and the mercy of Nineveh, one of the most famous biblical stories involving Assyria, is found in the book of Jonah. Jonah, a reluctant prophet, is commanded by God to go to Nineveh, the exceedingly great city, and warn them of coming destruction. He refuses at first, fleeing by ship, a choice that leads to a storm, his being thrown overboard, and the famous encounter with a great fish that swallows him whole. After 3 days, Jonah relents and travels to Nineveh. And here comes the twist. The people of Nineveh, these supposed cruel and godless pagans, repent. From the king to the cattle, they put on sackcloth, fast, and humble themselves, and God spares them. It is one of the Bible's most radical moments. Assyria, the very image of wickedness, responds with humility. The empire listens. Jonah is furious. But the lesson is clear. Even the mightiest, most brutal nations can choose mercy. Even they can change. Even they can be saved. It's a story less about empire and more about grace. And it shows how deeply Nineveh lived not just in Jewish fear, but in the moral imagination of a people asking what justice and forgiveness truly mean, a symbol across cultures in later Christian texts and traditions. Nineveh and Assyria became metaphors for the fallen world, for the kingdom of man in rebellion against the kingdom of God. Like Babylon, Assyria was absorbed into a broader symbol of worldly arrogance and divine reckoning. In Islamic tradition, too, Jonah, Yunus, and Nineveh appear as part of the Quranic narrative, again emphasizing repentance, mercy, and the power of prophecy. Across civilizations, Assyria became a ghost of grandeur, invoked not to recall its roads and taxes, but its moral weight. It became a warning, a shadow, a name you remembered not for what it built, but for what it meant. Echoes in the East in Mesopotamian culture. Long after the fall of Nineveh, Assyria continued to influence regional memory. The Neo-Babylonians, who conquered them, preserved Assyrian royal traditions, even as they cursed their cruelty. The Achaemenid Persians adopted parts of their imperial model governorships, road systems, military ranks, and continued building in cities like Ashur and Babylon. Even Alexander the Great, upon conquering these lands, stood among Assyrian ruins, perhaps wondering at their lost glories. Assyria, it seems, never entirely vanished. It remained in how rulers ruled, how scribes recorded, how memory was shaped, not as a living people, but as an archetype, one that both inspired and warned those who came after. The long memory of dust for 2 millennia, Assyria was gone, its language forgotten, its cities nameless mounds, its stories buried beneath scripture and myth. And yet, it was never truly lost, because memory is not always held in monuments. Sometimes it's held in fear, sometimes in forgiveness, sometimes in prophecy, and sometimes in silence. Think of the child hearing of Jonah in Sunday school, of a scholar puzzling over the names of long-dead kings, of an imam reciting the Quran, mentioning Yunus and Nineveh, of a traveler wandering the ruins outside Mosul, wondering who once stood where they now walk. These are the new Assyrians, not in blood, but in remembrance. You are one of them now, because once you carry the name of Nineveh in your thoughts, once you picture those walls and hear the roar of Sennacherib's lion hunt in your dreams, you keep them alive, not as conquerors, but as part of our human echo. Now, as your breathing deepens and the last threads of Assyria's name drift into memory, we prepare for the final moments of our journey, a closing reflection, a soft farewell to the empire that once ruled the world and now rules only in dreams. Not all history is made of dates and stone. Some of it lives in the in-between places, in half-remembered dreams, in flickers behind the eyes, in what might have been. Tonight, allow me to tell you a story, not from a tablet or scroll, but from the quiet realm of dream. This is not the record of how Assyria fell, but perhaps how it felt. Close your eyes gently now. Breathe in and listen. The dream begins. The sun over Nineveh is dimmer today. There is a golden haze in the sky, like the gods are holding their breath. A wind rolls over the rooftops, through the hanging gardens, over the lion cages, and into the open halls of the palace, where the king does not sleep. He sits alone. His name Ashurbanipal, or maybe Esarhaddon, or some other name long buried by the dust. But here, in this dream, he is simply the king, not yet defeated, not yet gone. He gazes out from the high walls, looking over the empire he built with steel and blood. He sees fires burning in the far east, too distant to hear the screams. He feels the ground tremble faintly beneath his sandals. Still, he waits, not for war, but for understanding. The voice of the city from the stones of Nineveh rises, a whisper, not a voice exactly, but a feeling. It says, "We have stood too long on cracked foundations." It says, "We grew tall without kindness." It says, "Our hands reached far, but our hearts stayed small." And as the night settles in, the city remembers. It remembers the scribes bent over tablets, the children playing in shadowed courtyards, the queen brushing scented oil into her hair. It remembers the soldiers who never returned from distant frontiers, the captives brought in chains, the prayers murmured in temples when no one answered back. Nineveh breathes, and in this dream it weeps, The last night the king rises. He walks through his palace barefoot, alone, past murals of winged bulls and hunting gods, past empty banquet halls and gardens gone dry. He runs his fingers along the walls that once shook with laughter and song. He steps into the chamber of stars, the room where priests once read the heavens. There are no stars tonight, only cloud, only silence. He speaks aloud, but no one hears. Was it not enough? Was it ever real? And as the gates begin to splinter far below, he does not run, he kneels. And for the first time in many years, he prays, not for victory, but for forgiveness. A gentle collapse. The city does not burn in chaos here. Not in this retelling. It simply sighs. The walls crack not with fury, but with age. The statues tip slowly, like they are bowing to time itself. The gods grow quiet, tired from centuries of blood. And the river Tigris swells, rising gently, tenderly, like it means to carry Nineveh home. When dawn comes, there are no screams, only bird song and a field of wildflowers blooming where a throne once stood. A memory etched in sleep now, drift further still. Imagine a child in a distant age, sitting by a fire. An old storyteller begins. Once long ago, there was a city made of gold. It rose so high, it touched the stars, but it forgot to be kind. And so the wind carried it away, and the child sleeps with that image curled behind their eyes. Just as you sleep now, Assyria fell, not with the wrath of heaven, nor the roar of gods, but like all things born from pride and pain it passed. And in its passing, it asked only to be remembered, not for the wars, not for the cruelty, but for the possibility, the fragile, flickering truth that all empires, even the greatest, are made of people. And people are made of dreams. Sleep now, if you haven't already. And if your eyes still linger open, we will close with one final section, a farewell soft, still, and timeless. The cities are dust. The kings are ash. The lion hunts and war chariots, the palaces and scrolls, the dreams of empire, all of it rests now beneath the quiet soil. And yet, something still speaks. This is not the voice of conquest, not the trumpet of victory, but something softer, a final whisper from Assyria, not from a throne, but from the earth. A land once loud, imagine walking now barefoot across the plains of northern Mesopotamia. The air is dry, the wind is slow, and scattered across the ground are the remains of what once was. Shards of pottery, broken bones, carved stones with strange, curling script. You step carefully, reverently, because somewhere beneath your feet are the buried gates of Nineveh, the courtyards of Ashur, the ziggurats that once scraped the very sky. This land was once loud, filled with the clash of iron, the cries of kings, the rhythms of scribes writing into the night. But it is not loud now. It is listening. To you, echoes in the dust in museums. You may see a bas-relief of a king slaying a lion frozen mid-roar. In libraries, you may find tablets inscribed with dreams, rituals, and the movements of stars. In scripture, you'll hear their names: Ashur, Nineveh, the king of the north, invoked in both warning and wonder. And in your own heart, if you've come this far, you may feel it too, that distant echo, that longing to remember what was lost, that soft ache of time. Assyria has no descendants in the political sense, no lasting lineage, no living tongue, but it has echoes in language, in law, in the very concept of empire. And now, in you, why we remember, we do not tell the story of Assyria to glorify war, or kings, or empires. We tell it because it teaches us something eternal. That power without compassion cannot last. That even greatness must bend to time. That knowledge preserved in clay can outlive sword and crown. And that sometimes what matters most is simply being remembered, to be part of the great human story, to rise, to fall, and to be whispered of long after. As you drift away, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. You are no longer in your bed, but beneath the stars of ancient Mesopotamia. The air smells of dust and river water. A fire flickers nearby. An old voice tells you of cities made of gold, of lions and gods, of kings who ruled the world and then vanished into legend. And in this story, you are not just a listener. You are a keeper, a gentle guardian of memory. Assyria lives, in a way, because you listened, because you cared, because you let it into your dreams. So now, as your eyes close and your body sinks into stillness, let Nineveh sleep beside you. Let the winds of the Tigris cradle you. Let the voice of time carry you softly into night. You've reached the end of the journey. If you are still awake, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with your heart. Wherever you are in the world, whatever the hour, know that the past remembers those who remember it. Sleep well, traveler. Until next time.